March 10, 1943, RAF Debden Airfield, Essex, England. The sky hung low that morning, bruised with cloud the color of old iron. Across the muddy tarmac of Debden, mechanics in oil-stained coveralls stood with arms crossed, staring at the newcomer with a mixture of bewilderment and disgust. She sat there like a monument to American excess, a beast of riveted aluminum and brute force, her massive radial engine jutting forward like the snout of some primordial creature. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, 7 tons of metal, the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built. Her wings were thick as barn doors. Her fuselage, bloated and ungainly, dwarfed the sleek Spitfires parked beside her. One British ground crewman spat into the mud and muttered what many were thinking: "She'll never turn with a Jerry. Too bloody fat." The American pilots weren't much more optimistic. They'd trained on nimble P-40s and dreamed of flying the elegant P-38 Lightning or the sharp-nosed P-51 Mustang. Instead, they'd been handed this Jug asterisk. That's what they called her. The Jug. Short for Juggernaut. It wasn't a compliment. Captain Hub Zemk of the 56th Fighter Group stood beneath the Thunderbolt's wing, his jaw tight, his eyes tracing the contours of an aircraft that seemed to embody everything wrong with American engineering. Too big, too heavy, too thirsty for fuel. The RAF liaison officer had been blunt the day before. "Your machine is a liability, Captain. She climbs like a brick and turns like a lorry. The Luftwaffe will eat you alive." Zemk said nothing. He lit a cigarette and watched the gray clouds drift eastward toward occupied Europe, toward the wolves of the Luftwaffe who ruled those skies with fearsome efficiency. In 1 month, those wolves would be bleeding. In 1 month, the Jug would prove every doubter a fool. But on that cold March morning, no one believed it possible. With red lines tracing the routes, bombers would fly into the heart of the Reich. Young men, barely out of their teens, sat on wooden benches and smoked, their faces tight with the knowledge that many would not return. The casualty rates were staggering. The previous week, a mission to Bremen had cost the 8th Air Force 16 B-17s, 160 men, dead or captured in a single afternoon. The brass kept promising fighter escorts with the range to protect them. And now, here was the answer: the P-47 Thunderbolt, a fighter so heavy she could barely get off the ground. A fighter the British test pilots had condemned as a death trap. A fighter that looked like she'd been designed by a committee of engineers who'd never seen combat. But looks, as history would prove, could be deceiving. To understand the disbelief, one must first understand the war in the air as it existed in the spring of 1943. For nearly 4 years, the Luftwaffe had dominated European skies with a lethal combination of experience, tactics, and machinery. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 were not merely aircraft. They were instruments of terror, flown by men who had cut their teeth over Poland, France, and the deserts of North Africa. These were not rookie pilots. These were veterans, many with dozens of kills, some with over 100. They flew in disciplined formations, exploited energy tactics, and understood the geometry of death better than any air force in the world. The German fighter pilots were legends in their own time. Names like Adolf Galland, Werner Mölders, and Erich Hartmann became synonymous with aerial mastery. These men had flown hundreds of combat missions. They had developed tactics: the asterisk swarm formation, the vertical scissors, the high-side gun pass, that turned dogfighting into a science. They knew how to use the sun, how to exploit altitude, how to lead a target moving at 300 miles per hour while pulling 4 Gs in a turn. And they had aircraft that matched their skill. The Bf-109, with its fuel-injected engine and cannon armament, when the United States Army Air Forces began daylight bombing raids over occupied Europe in 1942, the cost was catastrophic. The American doctrine was simple: mass formations of B-17 flying fortresses, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, would fly in tight defensive boxes and fight their way to the target and back. The theory was that overlapping fields of fire would keep the German fighters at bay. The reality was slaughter. Unescorted bombers, those lumbering symbols of American industrial might, fell from the sky in droves. Flak and fighters tore them apart. Young men burned alive at 20,000 feet, their screams lost in the howl of wind and engines. Entire bomber groups were decimated in single missions. Crews flew 25-mission tour knowing the odds of survival were less than 1 in 4. The 8th Air Force was bleeding, and the solution was obvious: long-range fighter escorts. But there was a problem. No Allied fighter had the range, the endurance, or the survivability to accompany the bombers deep into the Reich and return home. The Supermarine Spitfire, beloved and lethal, the savior of Britain during the dark days of 1940, had the range of a house cat. She could barely make it across the Channel and back. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with her twin engines and distinctive twin-boom design, had the range, but suffered catastrophic engine failures in the cold European altitudes. Pilots froze in their cockpits. Engines quit at 25,000 feet, leaving them as gliding targets for the Germans. The North American P-51 Mustang, the future savior of the bomber campaign, was still in development, still months away from operational deployment with the Merlin engine that would make her legendary. That left the Thunderbolt, and nobody wanted her. The P-47 was born not from elegance, but from desperation. In 1940, as Europe burned and the Luftwaffe terrorized the skies, the United States Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a new fighter. The specifications were ambitious: high speed, heavy armament, and above all, survivability. Republic Aviation, led by the brilliant but stubborn engineer Alexander Kartvili, took the requirement to heart. He designed the P-47 around a single, uncompromising idea: build a fighter that could take her engine. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp was a 2,000 horsepower radial monster, the most powerful engine ever fitted to a fighter. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each one the size of a man's head, drove a massive 4-bladed propeller 13 feet in diameter. The engine alone weighed over a ton. To extract maximum power at high altitude, where the air was thin, Republic fitted the P-47 with a turbo supercharger, a complex system of turbines and ducting that compressed incoming air and forced it into the engine. The supercharger was housed in the rear fuselage, connected to the engine by thick metal ducts that ran beneath the cockpit. It was an engineering marvel, and it made the Thunderbolt the fastest fighter above 25,000 feet. But it also added weight, lots of weight. Her airframe was reinforced, armored, redundant. The cockpit was surrounded by armor plating, thick steel plates behind the pilot's seat, armored glass in the windscreen. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, lined with rubber that would swell and close bullet holes. Critical systems, hydraulics, electrical control cables, were duplicated. She could absorb punishment that would shred a Messerschmitt. Pilots who flew her in combat returned with stories that defied belief: cannon shells punching clean through the fuselage without hitting anything vital, wings riddled with bullet holes still generating lift, engines trailing smoke and oil but still running, still pulling the aircraft home. But all that armor, all that power came at a cost. She was heavy, 14,000 pounds fully loaded. The Spitfire weighed less than 7,000. The Bf-109 barely 6,000. In the calculus of dogfighting, weight is death. A heavy fighter cannot turn inside an enemy, cannot climb quickly from low altitude, cannot accelerate out of trouble. Newton's laws are unforgiving. Mass times acceleration equals force. The more mass, the more force required to change direction, and the P-47 had mass in abundance. The mathematics were damning. When the RAF test pilots at Boscombe Down flew the early P-47s in the winter of 1942, They returned with scathing reports. "Utterly unsuited for combat," one wrote. "A defenseless target below 15,000 feet. Rate of roll poor. Rate of climb abysmal. Turning radius comparable to a Lancaster bomber." Another report was even more blunt. "This aircraft will not survive first contact with the enemy." The Air Ministry recommended against adoption. The Americans, reading the same reports, were equally skeptical. The 56th Fighter Group, the first unit equipped with Thunderbolts, spent the winter of 1943 training in near mutiny. Pilots joked bitterly that they'd been handed flying coffins, that they'd be dead within a week of combat. In the officers' club at Debden, over pints of warm English beer, they composed mock obituaries and speculated on whether their families would receive enough of their remains for a proper burial. The mood was gallows humor masking genuine fear. These were men who had volunteered to fly fighters, who dreamed of dogfighting with the grace and skill of the aces they'd read about. Instead, they'd been given a 7-ton truck with wings. Hub Zemk, their commander, was not a man given to optimism, but he was a man given to analysis. A pre-war Army Air Corps pilot, Zemk had the mind of an engineer and the demeanor of a high school math teacher. He didn't inspire men with fiery speeches. He inspired them with logic. He studied the Thunderbolt not with affection, but with the cold eye of a mechanic dissecting an engine. He noted her flaws. Sluggish at low altitude, poor rate of climb below 15,000 feet, heavy on the controls, a tendency to wallow in turns like a cargo ship in heavy seas. But he also noted something else, something the critics had missed. At high altitude, the Thunderbolt came alive. Above 25,000 feet, where the air was thin and the cold could kill a man in minutes, the P-47's turbo-supercharged engine breathed deep and roared. She was fast, faster than any fighter in the European theater at altitude. Her top speed at 30,000 feet exceeded 420 miles per hour, faster than a Bf-109, faster than an FW-190, faster than anything the Luftwaffe could field. And she could dive like a meteor. Her massive weight, such a liability in turning, became an asset in the vertical. She could roll inverted, pull the stick back, and plunge toward the earth at speeds that would tear the wings off a Messerschmitt. Her airframe was so strong, her controls so well designed, that she could exceed 450 miles per hour in a vertical dive without buffeting, without losing control, without the wings shearing off. German pilots who tried to escape by diving discovered, to their horror, that the Thunderbolt could follow them down, could catch them, could pull out of the dive at the last possible moment, while the German fighter, lighter and more fragile, either pulled apart from the stress or slammed into the ground. And her firepower, 8 Browning, 50 caliber machine guns, 4 per wing, was devastating. Each gun was 5 feet long, weighed over 60 pounds, and fired armor-piercing incendiary rounds at a rate of 800 rounds per minute. The 50 caliber round was not the largest weapon in the air war. The Germans flew with 20 and 30 cannons that fired explosive shells. But what the 50 cal lacked in explosive power, it made up for in reliability and volume. The German cannons were deadly but prone to jamming, limited in ammunition, and required precise aim. The Thunderbolts, 50 cals, were reliable, accurate, and carried over 3,000 rounds between them. A 2-second burst meant over 400 rounds in the air. When all 8 guns fired in unison, they sounded like the tearing of the sky itself. The recoil was so severe it slowed the aircraft. Pilots described it as hitting a wall of air, and on the receiving end the effect was catastrophic. The 50 cal rounds could punch through aluminum skin, sever control cables, ignite fuel tanks, and shred engines. Gun camera footage from P-47s shows German fighters simply disintegrating under the hail of fire, wings folding, fuselages breaking apart, pilots ejecting in desperation if they had time. Zemk began to see a strategy. The Thunderbolt could not dogfight at low altitude. She could not turn with a Bf-109 in a horizontal scissors, but she didn't need to. She could fight a different kind of war, a war of energy, of altitude, of brutal slashing attacks from above. The doctrine was simple: maintain altitude advantage, dive on the enemy, fire, use speed to climb back to altitude, repeat. Boom and zoom. Never turn with the enemy. Never get slow. Never get low. Use the sun. Use gravity. Use the Thunderbolt's strengths and avoid her weaknesses. It was a doctrine born of necessity, a doctrine that required iron discipline and absolute trust in the machine. And it was a doctrine that would be tested in blood. April 15, 1943, 27,000 feet above the Dutch coast. The first mission was a disaster, or so it seemed. The 56th Fighter Group, 36 Thunderbolts in tight formation, escorted a box of B-17s to the submarine pens at Aviation coast. The day was clear, the sky a pale blue dome stretching to infinity. Far below, the North Sea glittered like hammered pewter. The bomber crews were tense but hopeful. For the first time, they had escorts that could stay with them deep into occupied territory. The P-47s, heavy and ungainly on the ground, looked almost graceful at altitude, their silver shapes catching the sun. The Luftwaffe came up to meet them 20 miles from the target. Focke-Wulf 190s, a full asterisk group of them, 30 or more, rising out of the haze like sharks sensing blood. The German fighters were nimble and aggressive, their pilots veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had flown against Soviet I-16s and La GG-3s and learned to kill with ruthless efficiency. They swarmed the American formation, their radial engines howling, their cannons flashing. The Thunderbolt pilots, still green, still learning, made the mistake Zemk had warned them against. They tried to dogfight. They yanked their heavy fighters into tight turns, bleeding speed, bleeding altitude, and the Germans exploited every mistake. A P-47 from the 61st Squadron tried to turn inside an FW-190 and stalled, tumbling into a spin. The German pilot followed him down and finished him with a burst of cannon fire. Another Thunderbolt, caught low and slow, took 20 shells in the engine and trailed smoke and flame as it fell toward the sea. 2 P-47s went down. The rest limped home, pilots shaken, convinced the skeptics had been right. In the debriefing room, the mood was grim. Men sat in silence, smoking, replaying the fight in their minds. Zemk stood at the front of the room, his face unreadable. He let the silence stretch. Then he spoke. Who stayed high? One hand went up. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a quiet farm boy from Oklahoma, barely 22 years old. Zemk nodded. Tell us what you did. Johnson's voice was steady. I stayed at 27,000, saw an FW-190 below me, maybe 3,000 feet down. I rolled in, dived on him, fired a long burst. Didn't get him. But he broke off, tried to climb after me, but I was faster. I climbed back up and he gave up, went after someone else. Zemk turned to the rest of the room. Johnson survived because he didn't fight the Focke-Wulf's fight. He fought the Thunderbolt's fight. He walked to the blackboard and drew a simple diagram. A P-47 above, an enemy below, arrows showing the dive and climb. We do not dogfight, he said, his voice flat and unyielding. We do not turn, we fight at altitude. We dive, we shoot, we climb. If the enemy is below us, we own the fight. If he's above us, we run. Speed is life. Altitude is life. Everything else is death. The pilots listened. Some believed. Some did not. But in the weeks that followed, as they flew mission after mission, as they watched the Germans scatter when a Thunderbolt dived from the sun, they began to understand. The P-47 was not a Spitfire. She was not a ballerina dancing through the sky. She was a sledgehammer, and if you swung her correctly, she could break anything. May 1943, The Reckoning. The numbers from that month would become legend. In the span of 30 days, the 56th Fighter Group alone, just one unit, flying the despised Thunderbolt, destroyed 39 confirmed German fighters. 39. The number was staggering. In 1 month, a single group had inflicted losses on the Luftwaffe equivalent to an entire Jeschwader asterisk. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to aerial dominance, suddenly found themselves hunted. Messerschmitt pilots who tried to climb and engage the high-flying P-47s discovered they couldn't catch them. The Thunderbolt, with her turbo-supercharger screaming, could outclimb them above 25,000 feet. The Bf-109's engine, starved for oxygen in the thin air, wheezed and struggled while the P-47's turbo forced air into her cylinders and roared. Focke-Wulf pilots who tried to dive away found the P-47 could dive faster, could pull out of the dive without her wings shearing off, and could deliver a hailstorm of .50 caliber fire that shredded aluminum and flesh alike. Gun camera footage from that month shows FW-190s pulling into steep dives, their pilots desperate to escape, only to have Thunderbolts follow them down, closing the distance, the camera shaking from the recoil of 8 guns firing, and then the German fighter coming apart, a wing folding, a tail snapping off, a fireball erupting as the fuel tank ignites. German pilots began to recognize the silhouette. The big, bulky fighter with the razorback fuselage, the bubble canopy, the massive radial engine. They called her Donnerblitz asterisk Thunderbolt, and they learned to fear her. One Luftwaffe ace, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, captured later in the war and interrogated by American intelligence, described the experience in language that betrayed genuine respect. You could not run from the jug. If she was above you, she was death. Her pilot would dive and you would hear the sound, like cloth tearing, like the sky ripping open. And then the tracers, so many tracers, streams of fire, and your aircraft would come apart. We tried to lure them low, to force them to turn, to drag them into a dogfight where our advantages would show. But their discipline was good. They would not take the bait. They stayed high, and they killed us from above. The transformation was not just tactical, it was psychological. The American pilots, once bitter and resigned, now flew with ferocious confidence. They had learned to trust the Thunderbolt. They had learned that if they flew her correctly, she would bring them home. And with that trust came aggression. They hunted. They decorated their Thunderbolts with kill markings, with nose art depicting cartoon jugs smashing swastikas, with names like Big Ass Bird and Razorback and the Hun Hunter. They painted their propeller spinners in bright colors, red, yellow, checkerboard patterns, so the Germans would see them coming and know what awaited. It was psychological warfare, a message written in paint and aluminum. We are here, we are not afraid, and we are coming for you. The ground crews, those same mechanics who had cursed the P-47 in March, now worked through the night to keep every bird airborne. They patched bullet holes, and there were many, because the Thunderbolt absorbed punishment that would down any other fighter, and marveled at how the big radial engine kept running even when half its cylinders were shot out. Stories spread. A P-47 from the 78th Fighter Group returned to base with 3 feet of its starboard wing missing, torn away by cannon fire from an FW-190, and still flew straight and true. The pilot landed without incident, climbed out, and asked for a cup of coffee. Another Thunderbolt took a direct hit from an 88 flak shell that punched through behind the cockpit, leaving a hole large enough for a man to crawl through, and the pilot brought her home, flew her across the channel, and set her down on the runway at Debden like he was parking a car. The Thunderbolt became a symbol not just of American engineering, but of American philosophy, overwhelming force, brutal simplicity, and an almost reckless faith in the capacity to endure. She was not subtle, she was not graceful, but she worked, and in war what works survives. The Luftwaffe adjusted. They always did. German tacticians studied the Thunderbolt, analyzed her strengths and devised counters. Intelligence officers interrogated captured American pilots, examined wreckage, and compiled reports. They noted the P-47's blind spot directly below and behind, where the pilot's visibility was limited. They noted that the Thunderbolt, for all her high-altitude prowess, was vulnerable at low altitude, where her weight and poor rate of climb became liabilities. They began to attack from below, exploiting the blind spot, using their superior low-altitude maneuverability to force engagements near the ground. They ambushed returning P-47s, low on fuel and ammunition, and scored kills against pilots who had let their guard down, who thought the danger was over once they crossed the coast. But for every adaptation, the Americans adapted in turn. They flew in mutual support formations, two-ship elements called the Fluid Four, where one pilot covered the other's 6 o'clock. They used their radios, far superior to German equipment, to coordinate attacks, to call out threats, to vector flights toward enemy formations. German radios were short-range, prone to static, and often failed at altitude. American radios worked. Pilots could talk to each other, could warn each other, could coordinate with bomber crews and ground controllers. It was a force multiplier, and most importantly, they kept flying. Every day, every mission. The 8th Air Force bombing campaign intensified, and the Thunderbolts went with them, deeper and deeper into the Reich. The losses were real. Pilots died. Good men, young men, some with families back home, some barely old enough to vote, burned or frozen or shot to pieces at altitude. Lieutenant David Schilling watched his wingman take cannon fire, watched the P-47 roll inverted and fall, watched the parachute deploy too late, and landed that day in silence, his face a mask. Captain Walker Mahurin shot down 5 German fighters in a single mission and came home to find a letter waiting. His brother, a B-24 pilot, was missing over the North Sea. The cost was real, but the mathematics of attrition were shifting. For every Thunderbolt lost, 2 or 3 German fighters fell. And while the Germans were bleeding experienced pilots, men who took years to train, who could not be replaced, the Americans were learning, adapting, and growing more lethal with each engagement. The symbolic weight of the Thunderbolt extended beyond the cockpit. To the bomber crews, the sight of P-47s weaving above them at high altitude became a talisman of survival. The bomber pilots called them little friends, though there was nothing little about them. The name was ironic, affectionate. When the flak was thick and the Messerschmitts were closing in, when engines were shot out and men were dying in the freezing fuselages, the sound of Pratt and Whitney radials growling overhead was the sound of salvation. The Thunderbolts would roll in, diving through the bomber formations with reckless courage, and the German fighters would scatter like wolves chased from a flock. One B-17 pilot, Captain John Lucky Luckadoo, interviewed 50 years after the war, described it with a tremor in his voice that age had not diminished. We'd be shot to hell, engines smoking, men wounded and dying, the intercom filled with screams, and then we'd hear them, the jugs. You couldn't see them at first, they'd be too high, but you'd hear them on the radio. Hang on, boys, we're coming. And then you'd see them come out of the sun, just black dots at first, and then they'd grow, and the whole sky would fill with the sound of their guns. 850s per plane, and there'd be a dozen of them diving, and it sounded like God tearing the sky in half. But the true measure of the Thunderbolt's transformation was not in the kill counts or the survival rates. It was in what the pilots themselves came to believe. The men who had cursed the P-47 in March were, by June, the most fanatical advocates of her virtues. They spoke of her not with affection. This was not a love affair, not in the romantic sense, but with a kind of grim reverence, the way a soldier speaks of a rifle that has saved his life a dozen times over. She was ugly. She was heavy. She guzzled fuel at a rate that made logistics officers weep. She required 2 men to push her propeller through a pre-start check because the radial engine was so massive. But she was there's asterisk, and she was lethal. Hub Zemk, in a letter to a friend back in Montana, wrote in his precise engineer's prose, "The Thunderbolt is not a fighter in the classical sense. She does not dance. She does not duel. She is a weapon of war, pure and unadorned, designed to destroy the enemy with maximum efficiency and bring her pilot home alive. And in that, she has no equal." The transformation was complete. The Jug, the fat, ugly, useless Jug, had become the most feared American fighter in the European theater, and the Germans knew it. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from mid-1943 describe the P-47 in language dripping with grudging respect. One report, captured after the war and now archived in the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, noted, "The enemy's Republic fighter operates at altitudes where our aircraft struggle. Its pilots are aggressive and well-trained. Its firepower is devastating. Its construction allows it to absorb damage that would destroy our fighters. Engagement is to be avoided unless conditions are overwhelmingly favorable, numerical superiority of at least 3-1, and positional advantage." To be clear, the Luftwaffe, the air force that had terrorized Europe, that had destroyed the Polish Air Force in 72 hours, that had brought the RAF to its knees during the Battle of Britain, that had ravaged Soviet aviation in the opening months of Barbarossa, was now avoiding engagement with the Thunderbolt unless they had numerical superiority and positional advantage. That was the measure of her transformation. That was the measure of the fear she inspired. The symbolic resonance of the Thunderbolt extended into the realm of ideology. The P-47 was not just a machine, she was a statement. She represented the American way of war. Not elegant, not refined, but powerful, enduring, and backed by limitless industrial capacity. Every Thunderbolt that rolled off the Republic Aviation production line in Farmingdale, New York, was a testament to what the Axis powers could not match. An economy so vast, so productive, that it could afford to build heavy fighters by the thousands and throw them into the sky with abandon. Republic produced over 15,000 P-47s during the war. 15,000. The Germans, by contrast, built fewer than 35,000 Bf-109s over the entire war, and that was their most produced fighter. The Germans, by the spring of 1943, were already beginning to feel the strain. Their factories were bombed by the RAF at night and by the USAAF during the day. Their fuel supplies were dwindling as Allied bombers targeted refineries, and the Soviets pushed toward the Plosti oil fields. Their veteran pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Training new pilots took time, months, even years to produce an ace. And every time a Luftwaffe squadron encountered a formation of Thunderbolts, they burned precious fuel they could not replace, expended irreplaceable ammunition, and risked pilots they could not afford to lose. The P-47 was attrition warfare made manifest. She ground the Luftwaffe down, day by day, mission by mission, kill by kill. There was poetry in it, though the men who flew and died in those skies would never have used such a word. Poetry in the way the fat, ugly Jug became beautiful through function. Poetry in the way the American pilots learned to trust her, to push her to her limits, to wring every ounce of performance from her massive frame. Poetry in the way she absorbed bullets and shrapnel and cannon shells and still flew, still fought, still brought her pilot home. One pilot, Robert Johnson, who ended the war with 27 kills, nearly all in the Thunderbolt, described it years later in an interview. The Thunderbolt didn't care what you thought of her. She didn't care if you called her ugly or fat or useless. She just did her job, she fought. She killed. She survived. And if you respected her, if you flew her the way... By the autumn of 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer a liability. She was the backbone of the 8th Air Force's Fighter Command. The 56th Fighter Group, once doubters, became legends. Hub Zemk became an ace with 17 confirmed kills. Robert Johnson, the pilot who had stayed high during that first disastrous mission, became one of the war's leading aces with 27 kills, nearly all in the Thunderbolt. Other groups, the 78th, the 353rd, the 356th, equipped with P-47s and adopted Zemk's tactics, and the kill count soared. By the end of 1943, P-47 units had destroyed over 500 German aircraft in air-to-air combat. The Germans adapted and adapted again, but they could not stem the tide. The Thunderbolt's range was extended with drop tanks, large fuel tanks slung beneath the wings that could be jettisoned when empty, allowing her to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,000 miles. Her firepower was augmented with bombs and rockets, transforming her into a devastating ground attack platform. In the months before D-Day, P-47 strafed German airfields, rail yards, and troop columns, destroying locomotives, flak towers, and convoys. She became a multi-role weapon, equally lethal against fighters, bombers, trains, tanks, and trucks. The Luftwaffe's freedom of action in Western Europe evaporated. The skies that had once belonged to Germany now belonged to the Allies. And the Thunderbolt was the instrument of that transformation. But the cost was real. By the end of the war, over 3,000 P-47s had been lost in combat. Thousands of pilots had died, some shot down in flames over Germany, some killed by flak over France, some lost over the North Sea or the English Channel, their graves unknown, their names inscribed on memorials to the missing. The Thunderbolt was not invincible. She was simply better at surviving than anything else in the sky, and for the men who flew her, that was enough. That was everything. May 8, 1945, victory in Europe. When the war in Europe ended, the Thunderbolts were still flying. Eyes trudging westward to escape the Soviets. They flew over the liberated concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, where the true horror of the Nazi regime lay exposed in mass graves and skeletal survivors. The pilots looked down and saw the wreckage of a continent, the ruin of an ideology that had promised a 1,000-year empire and delivered only death. And they understood, in some wordless way, that they had been part of something larger than themselves. The Thunderbolt had been part of it too. She had been the hammer that broke the Luftwaffe, the shield that protected the bombers, the weapon that proved American resolve and American industry could not be defeated. She was not remembered with the romantic affection given to the Spitfire, the graceful defender of Britain. She was not celebrated with the sleek elegance of the Mustang, the long-range knight of the bomber streams. She was too brutal for that, too utilitarian. But she was remembered with respect, with gratitude, with the knowledge that she had done what no other fighter could do, survive the crucible of the European air war and emerge victorious. In the decades after the war, historians and aviation enthusiasts debated the merits of the great fighters of World War II. The Spitfire, graceful and deadly, the savior of Britain. The Mustang, elegant and long-ranged, the escort that turned the tide. The Messerschmitt, fast and heavily armed, the scourge of Allied bombers. And the Thunderbolt, heavy and brutal, the sledgehammer of the skies. But those who flew her, those who survived because of her, had no doubts. She was the best of them all, not because she was the fastest or the most maneuverable or the most beautiful, but because when it mattered, when the flak was bursting and the tracers were streaking past and the enemy was closing in and death was seconds away, she kept flying. She kept fighting, and she brought her pilot home. That was her legacy. That was her truth. She was the Jug, the fat, ugly, useless Jug. And she annihilated 39 German fighters in a single month and hundreds more in the months that followed, and she changed the course of the war in the air. They called her useless. History called her indispensable. There is a Thunderbolt preserved in a museum now, suspended from the ceiling of the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Her paint is faded, the olive drab and neutral gray weathered by time. Her propeller is still. Her 8.50 caliber guns, once instruments of death, are silent. Children walk beneath her and crane their necks upward, marveling at her size, her weight, the brutal functionality of her design. They do not know what she was. They cannot hear the roar of her engine, the scream of her dive, the sound of her guns tearing the sky. They cannot feel the cold at 30,000 feet, the adrenaline of combat, the relief of landing safely after a mission. But the men who flew her, those few who remain, they know. They come to the museum, old men now, stooped with age, their hands trembling, their faces lined with the years. They stand before her with tears in their eyes and memories that will not fade. They remember the cold, the fear, the friends who did not come back. Lieutenant Jimmy Stewart, who flew 42 years old when he died, whose name is on the memorial wall. Captain Walker Mahurin, shot down over France in 1944, who evaded capture and returned to the fight. Hub Zemk, who survived the war, who lived to see the jets and the space age, who never stopped believing in the Thunderbolt. And they remember the moment when the ugly, hated Jug proved herself, when she became not just a machine but a symbol of endurance, of resilience, of the idea that sometimes victory does not come from grace or elegance but from sheer, relentless, unbreakable will. The Thunderbolt was never beautiful, but she was true, and in the crucible of war, truth is the only beauty that matters.